Our next speaker is Jan Lambregts, Head of RaboResearch Global Economics and Markets. He leads a global team of analysts and strategists covering macroeconomics, foreign exchange, interest rates, credit, agricultural commodities and energy markets for key clients. Before moving to London in 2009 to lead the global team, Jan spent 7 years in Singapore and Hong Kong, focusing on all those things for Rabo clients, with particular focus on China and Japan. So he will be very well versed in that age-old Chinese proverb, or is it a Chinese curse? May we live in interesting times. They don't get much more interesting than right now. And Jan, it's fair to say, has travelled the furthest of anybody to be at the conference, all the way from London, came through Hong Kong and Melbourne, so he has really done the grand circle route. Please make him warmly welcome, Jan Lambregts.
Thank you for the kind introduction, ladies and gentlemen. It's a real pleasure to be here in Darwin. As Peter was alluding to, I'm a macro strategist, really. My team covers all sorts of things in financial markets, but myself, I'm a big picture kind of person. And the world's been my oyster since 2008, the great financial crisis, because there's been a succession of big macro themes, right? Trump's first trade wars, themes there. The aftermath, of course, the great financial crisis, COVID, the aftermath of that, war in Ukraine, now the Middle East. I mean, there's no shortage of it. Central banks that are very active. And within that context, I want to show you today a couple of the key topics that I think are important. And I'm using a phrase here that you will probably recognize, who has the cards? And it's, of course, what Trump likes to say to any visitor in the White House. Right? And typically, he, of course, thinks that the US holds all the cards and no one else does. And he used it specifically when Zelensky visited in February of last year. So I'll have a look at some of the key players out there, and I'll bring them up on my screen. These are not my drawing skills. This is AI at work for you. And we'll have a look at these major blocks. We'll focus mostly on the US and China. And we're going to have a look at what cards do they have, and from those cards, what strategy do I expect them to play? So let's jump in and first make the observation that the great game is indeed afoot, right? Statecraft is back. We're now in the 19th century with mobile phones. So there's a battle over commodities. There's actual battle over territory again, key choke points. It's all back to play for, if you will. And military parades have also come back in many countries, you may have noticed. Not just the traditional ones like North Korea. But it's not just parades. It's actual war in the case of the Middle East. And we will talk briefly about that as well. I'm happy to also answer questions afterwards. I'll be around for the rest of the day, so do hit me up if you want to talk a little bit more about it. Much more mundane is that it's also about the financial system itself. You will have seen the past 1.5 years questions about whether the dollar will still be the dominant currency, or if we're all going to be paying in yuan or euros or Australian dollar for that matter, or gold. So it's a lot of things that are being questioned there. And spoiler alert, despite the dramatic graphics I'm about to show you, I don't think the dollar's time is over. I think the dollar's hegemony is quite solidly entrenched from that perspective. So not so simple. It's a world full of statecraft. And statecraft is all about achieving your national security interests using economic, political, and military power. Now, of course, depending where you sit in the world, the situation is different. The US is able to use that military power, whereas if you're sitting in Europe or Australia, that's decidedly less a factor you can use. But it's a world we live in now, and we don't get a choice. We sort of are faced by it. So let's look at the key cards that some of these key players hold. And we start with the self-styled king of the West, Mr. Trump. And to be fair, his cards are pretty good. If you look at the strength of the US economy, which is consumer demand, it's the size of its GDP, right, the size of its economy. It's the fact that they have so many large companies that dominate, have set the standard for things like Microsoft, Apple, etc. And that is a real benefit, and it's particularly so if you consider that the US is, of course, leading an alliance of countries in the West. So that allied market is even bigger, if you will. I already talked about the US dollar. Now I think it will continue to dominate. And you can see that in the payment system, SWIFT payments. You see it in FX reserves, where the dollar has a dominant position. And you see it in the euro-dollar system. So everywhere that dollar comes back, and the benefits of that are material, right? It allows the US to run higher deficits than other countries can. It allows real power there, if you will. Now, does Trump only hold strong cards? I'd say there is one particular area of weakness which they have identified, and that is that the US has, over the past decades, steadily been deindustrializing. So it now wants to reindustrialize, but that won't be so easy. So that's the pair of twos, if you will. Right? They want to work on that again, and behind tariff walls, rebuild some of that industry. Briefly, from Trump over to the Queen of Europe, Ursula von der Leyen, the head of the Commission. Now, if you look at this picture, which I carefully chose, you see that the European leader isn't looking very happy. But moreover, all the other leaders are standing around her. Now, best they are advising, but they mostly seem to be looking at her cards and trying to push her one way or another. The thing is this: when you're not at the table, you're on the table. And Europe is increasingly not invited to the table, but decisions are made at the table that will influence Europe. Europe's aware of this. It wants to be strategically more autonomous, but you can't achieve this overnight. Now, many reports have been written. Europeans are quite good at writing reports, among which is the Draghi report, which highlights here in a quick summary that Europe needs to fix better access to critical materials, better access to affordable energy, use that then to keep its industry going, build national champions, and build up, rearm, because this is a world where might is right, and you do need your economic and political power to be supplemented with military power. Europe is economically strong, but politically divided, because most decisions in Europe are made unanimously, and there's 27 countries, and therefore 27 opinions. And actually 28 parties, because you have 27 countries, and Brussels itself is also a power. So there's 28 influences there. All of this will cost a lot of money, and the problem is, of course, that that will challenge political cohesion, right? Because voters will feel the pain here, if you will. Then someone who's really pleased to be in this presentation, of course, Mr. Putin. His economy is not a strong point right now. After a devastating war for 4 years in Ukraine, he's depleted most of his treasure. His FX reserves are gone. They have run a crafty shop in terms of the central bank, but its banking system is under pressure. Its economy is basically on its knees. It's a war economy, but it's not a healthy one. That's not to say that the economy will push regime change in Russia, right? I'm not saying that. I think that's very hard to achieve. Putin's hand is much weakened economically, but he has a good spoiler hand. And with the events in the Middle East, oil prices being higher, revenues from that increasing, arms now going, instead of to Ukraine, going to the Middle East, he thinks he has another chance at trying to get a good deal there in Ukraine for the moment, reconstitute and then continue the war a couple of years from now. So he has a good spoiler hand, what you would say. He's very much playing on Team China. He's the junior partner of Xi Jinping. They call this friends for life, best friends forever, if you will. But they're not very happy friends, I always feel. And definitely for Putin, it must be galling to be the junior partner there of Xi Jinping. And if I talk about Xi Jinping, let's bring him in. What are the cards of China? So we've talked about the US now. The US has decent cards, needs to reindustrialize. Europe has lots of plans, but needs to get on with it. Russia is in trouble. Xi Jinping has actually what the Americans don't have right now. He does have this industrial base. So production is China's strong point. This is the workshop of the world. What they do is they build champions, typically loss leading for 5 to 10 years. But after 5 to 10 years, they become world-class. Think electric vehicles, right? Electric vehicles from China are now the cheapest and the best, and a threat to anywhere, any auto sector out there in the world. So they build these champions, and then they produce twice as much as they need, and the other 50% they export, and they take market share everywhere. A very aggressive strategy from that perspective. Energy-wise, they remain very dependent on the Middle East. So what's happening there right now is a very big danger to the stability of their economy. Having said that, they have invested, they've played the board, or the table if you will, to use the casino analogy, in terms of energy. They've invested in renewables, fossil fuels, and nuclear. They're agnostic about this, but they've kept their sort of cost of energy per hour quite manageable, and they've electrified quite a bit in the background as well. That's important because, of course, the 21st century will all be about AI and quantum computing, so you need that electrification playing out. But like I said, what's happening in the Middle East right now is really proving a challenge for them. They produce a lot of steel. I already talked about the electric vehicles, so I'll be reasonably quick here. And they are, per capita, per head, the average Chinese has seen its lot improve a lot over the past couple of decades. Having said that, this is still a country that is at risk of growing old before it grows rich. Right? The demographics in China have turned. Its labor population has been shrinking for the past 15 years. They have tried to supplant, to push back against the hegemony of the dollar, to convince others to use the yuan, for example. But this has been with limited success. It's a little bit nibbling at the edges, a cut here, a cut there, but nothing too great there. And at the moment, they feel like increasingly they're being isolated because the US is isolating them. This is not paranoia on their end. And specifically, the US has cut them off from high-end semiconductors, which is the lifeblood of the 21st century, if you will. So you can sort of start seeing the competition between China and the US getting more ugly there, if you will. Right, so we've looked at everyone's cards, and the conclusion is that it's particularly the US and China that have good cards, but in different ways. So let's bring it to the table now, and I have here playing for the US, Donald J. Trump. I have playing for China, of course, Xi Jinping. I've invited to the table a few European leaders. I could have invited all 27 of them, or 28 if you count Ursula von der Leyen, but Merz and Macron will be playing. I got a few opportunistic players, Modi from India, or Erdogan from Turkey, right? And a few of the rogue players. So Kim Jong-un, the Ayatollah had a different engagement, but Putin was willing here to come up. We're not going to talk about all of them, right? You know, it goes a little bit beyond the scope, but we will talk mainly about the US and China again, and briefly touch upon the Eurozone and Putin. What is their strategy now? They got these cards. What do you do with that? And if we go back to the self-styled king of the West, Mr. Trump, it's like asking the question, does Trump have a plan? Okay, health/trigger warnings, right? I know Trump tends to live rent-free in a lot of people's head, right? So I'm trying to be as objective as possible, right? When I talk about Trump, it's actually more the US administration, and I do believe they have a plan. The issue is, it's a dynamic plan. They're building the ship as they're sailing it, so they will change it as they go. It's not a plan you are likely to like, because it's not an Australian plan. It's an America First plan. And even in the US, half the population doesn't seem to like it, so go figure. But they do have a plan, I think, and I'll run through it in a moment. And just because there's a plan doesn't mean it's well executed. That's another warning, right? So enough trigger warnings. At the heart of the plan is that the US has woken up a while back, and it believes that conflict with China is coming. Now, if you'd like to sleep well at night, we can call it hyper-competition, but it could be actual conflict, right? And the US feels it's ill-prepared for this conflict. It is de facto the US, the hegemon of the 21st century. It controls globally, but it feels challenged by China. China, which is after at least hegemony in Asia, or the Asia Pacific, potentially, if you make it wider. This is unacceptable to the US. So some sort of conflict is brewing there in the background. I don't think a deal can be made here. I know Trump's the great deal maker, but I don't think a deal is likely. Because a deal would require China to admit that the US is the hegemon and they don't have further ambitions, and would have to open their market for the US, which they won't do. Instead, these two powers are circling around each other. The US has found out that China has weaponized rare earths. So the US wants time, 5 to 10 years, to build its capacity itself. China has found out that the US is cutting it off from high-end semiconductors. So they too are playing for time to build that capacity themselves. And in the meantime, they circle around each other, they have summit meetings, but you don't really see a deal coming through. What is the US now doing? 3 things. First of all, they're reshaping existing alliances. So the whole Western alliance is being reshaped. Now, this is an undiplomatic affair. You may have noticed the past 15 months. Because what previously was free now needs to be paid for. So the US was previously happy to do most of the military spending as long as they could be the boss. Now they want everyone in the West, including Australia, New Zealand, to spend upwards of 5% on defense. So it's no longer free. And they still will want to be the boss, of course. And you also need to spend most of that on US weapons. The other part of the what previously was free now is no longer so free, is that you were previously free to trade with whoever you wanted. But now they increasingly start pushing their allies around to impose tariffs on China as well, or to not provide certain goods to China. So we're being co-opted to isolate China, if you will. So that has been a fairly sore affair. You will have noticed the past 50 months for many. I don't think it's always unfair what the Americans are asking, but it's not been very diplomatic. Having said that, whenever they asked the Europeans diplomatically to spend more on the military the past 30 years or so, they never listened. So now, having been scared into action, there is actually something happening there, if you will. The second part is about investments. When these deals are being made on trade and et cetera, and tariffs, they also usually come with a demand to invest in the US. The headline numbers are stellar. Like Europe has committed to buying 750 billion worth of LNG in the next 3 years. It's unlikely that will happen unless the price of gas keeps rising. But wood for the trees, even if half of these investments from the Middle East, from Europe, from Australia, etc., from Korea, Japan, happen into the US, it would be very meaningful in terms of helping the US reindustrialize. The third part of this plan is that they may look at the financial system itself and try to overhaul it. And that's where we come to the conspiracy part of this presentation. Because every good presentation needs a bit of a conspiracy. And that's about crypto and stable coins. So we'll get to that in a moment. Hold your breath. We're building up to it. But if you bear this in mind, reshaping alliances, what previously is free, now needs to be paid for. Investments, maybe overhauling the financial system. That's a little bit the lens with which to look at what's happening in South America and in the Middle East. And it's very much a world in which that fight about commodities is live, and we'll get to that in a moment, right? But let's build up to that conspiracy part, because I know you have an appetite for that, of course. We'll start first with the central bank. This is Mr. Powell. He leads the central bank at the moment in the US. But he will be marched out of the casino shortly, because on May 15 he retires, and Kevin Warsh has been nominated to take over. He zooms in. Mr. Trump's very happy with the appointment of Kevin Warsh, of course. And economists are tumbling over one another to figure out how much rate hikes he will deliver, or better put, rate cuts probably. But they're probably not seeing the wood for the trees here. Because increasingly in the US, against the backdrop of this whole overhaul that I talked about, there'll be pressure on the central bank to help facilitate this. It's like asking yourself, what's the central bank for? Think of it like this. If you go to China and you ask the question, what's the central bank for? You know the answer, right? The central bank is there to make sure that the Communist Party of China remains in control. So increasingly, it's hard to say that in the West, the central bank's there just to fight inflation. If we're somehow preparing for conflict, it would also have to help to rearm or make our economy more resilient, et cetera, et cetera. And arguably, we've seen some of that already the past 15 years, right? Central banks have become more politically active. They have been printing money and giving support during COVID times, et cetera, et cetera. So we're on that slippery slope already. But that's all still pretty conventional compared to the conspiracy part. You see, some of the key economic advisors of Trump love crypto. Now, in part, that's a good enrichment scheme, and they issue meme coins, et cetera, et cetera. But in part, it's also a talk about stablecoin. And let me explain this to you. It won't be very technical, because I'm not a technically minded person, so that will help us. But stablecoin is on the blockchain. This key factor is that there's always a collateral one-on-one. If you issue a stablecoin token, it is typically backed up by a treasury bill. And this is where it gets interesting. If the US were to shift a significant amount of the global trade that's currently being done in dollars, cash dollars, into stablecoin, it would create a commensurate demand for treasury bills. Let me give an example. If they push $1 trillion worth of trade into stablecoin, they would create $1 trillion worth of demand for treasury bills. That extra demand would see interest rates fall and make it much easier for the US to finance themselves. His advisors are talking about it. They haven't taken concrete steps yet. Stablecoin is expanding some, nowhere near the amounts what you'd see. But I'm no longer laughing, because if I would have told you 18 months ago that tariffs would have been a thing, you would have thought I was crazy. So I thought I would include it at least here. Someone in my team asked, why would anyone agree to this? Why would you want a stablecoin? Aha. No one in this room wanted tariffs, but you got them anyway, right? This is what the hegemon does. Right? You get it shoved down your throat, whether you want it or not. That's the problem with these things. So if the US sees an example in this, it might do it. And bear in mind, the US has done this before. Go. Back again. My voice is loud, but not this loud. At the end of the Second World War, they set the system that we currently know. In 1971, when the Bretton Woods system fell, they again re-envisioned how the financial system works. So they have experience with this. And there you go. I want to bring this conversation also to the Middle East and talk a little bit about impact, right? Before I do that, again, I was trying to already alluding to it, but let me make it more vociferously, the argument. This is the 19th century of mobile phones, or the early 20th century, if you will. It's about securing commodities for your block, for your country. When you secure it, you secure the supply, that must be stable, and the price must be affordable. But the flip side of that is, for your adversaries, for your enemies, for your competitors, you raise the price. You make it more unstable. So think about that map I just showed you, but the 3 steps the US is taking. The action in Venezuela in January. Sure, long term it may lead to more oil production that the US controls. But the real short-term aim was mainly to cut off oil that goes cheap to Cuba and China. There's no more oil going to Cuba and China from Venezuela. That hurts the Chinese long term, and it probably means Cuba will fall in the next 1 or 2 years, the current regime. So that's in play, this kind of hyper-competition over commodities. Through that lens, you could also see part of the situation in Iran. Iran's about regime change, sure, won't be easy. It's about avoiding nuclear weapons falling in the wrong hands, yes. It's about red lines. If you paint a red line, but someone can just step over it, what is your credible deterrence, right? So don't underestimate that. But it's also about controlling oil, and if you control it, that Iranian oil is no longer going to China at a cheap discount. And similarly, Trump's trying to build a trade corridor that runs from India to the Middle East, and that runs over the northern border of Iran. So there's also an economic incentive there. So it's not just economics, but it does fit into that picture, if you will. The administration, though, is gambling big here, I would say. Let me run you through sort of how we approach this, right? We, first of all, on a daily basis, comment on the financial markets, and we produce a report, and we try to cover what's happening there. But the way we've tried to cover this is we set a spectrum of scenarios, and within that, we position our base scenario. On the positive side of the spectrum, in what's a bad situation, so it's relatively positive, you have a quick end to the war, right? Oil prices average around $80, $90 a barrel. That's bad, I mean, worse than it was, but probably manageable, right? If you then go to worse scenarios, it's typically because the Strait of Hormuz stays closed for longer, the disruption's bigger. And the very worst scenarios talk about the actual damage being done to the energy production system there, right? Refineries, gas plants, gas fields, oil fields, etc., etc. Some of the damage is done because you close them down, and when you close them down, they're never made to be closed down. So if you do it in a reasonably orderly fashion, you get damage. That's one. But of course, there's also actual rockets, drones flying that are also damaging. And at the moment, we're in an escalation phase. And then you're talking really about Strait of Hormuz closed for 3 to 6 months, $120 per barrel. Damage to facilities, you go $150 a barrel or more. There's no exact science here. These are ballpark numbers you will appreciate, right? There's no good models for this. Now, what we're seeing at the moment is that the war is lasting already longer than the most positive scenario I sketched. So at the moment, our baseline scenario is sort of shifting more towards this will last until mid-April, at which point the Americans will walk away and declare victory. The Israelis may still continue for a while, hitting its leadership, etc., etc. But the Strait of Hormuz gets cleared up. It will take a while to do that. And the energy production facilities get repaired, right? Maybe there will be a regime change of sorts, but at least there'll have to be a commitment that they'll stop pursuing nuclear weapons, or the realization that they can't do so anymore in Iran, simply because they've been hit so much. One reason to still be a little bit optimistic here is that this is not a crusade, right, that the Americans have launched. This is not about bringing democracy, like George W. Bush said at the time. Trump is openly talking about that he would like the Venezuelan option, but the Venezuelan option, he went into Caracas, arrested Maduro, took him out, and let the vice president take over. So if that's the story, then you need to change a whole lot in Iran. But Iran would, of course, have to commit to stopping itself and, at the same time, stopping the pursuit of nuclear weapons. And I can sort of tell you, tongue-in-cheek, I can already hear the press conference about how Trump will do this, because he is, of course, an interesting character, to put it mildly. But you could just hear him say it. There's so much winning, I've grown tired of it, I'll walk away from it. He does sort of create his own bubble of success from that perspective, right? So I think that's the relative positive here, and that's why we are still on that scenarios there. But it lasting till mid-April, and then you have these disruptions, you get oil prices still north of $100 a barrel on average, of course. In terms, and let me finish this one up, in terms of the impact, the US itself, this is not welcome. They're energy independent, but it will hurt them. But the US is not where the biggest impact is felt. The biggest impact is felt in Asia, and here, if you go a little bit wider, Asia Pacific, right, in Australia as well. Quite a high dependency on crude oil from the Middle East, but more importantly, on the derivative products. So most importantly, diesel, of course. Right? Farming doesn't work without diesel, but mining doesn't either. I don't have to tell you that, but also bunker fuel to get the freight ships going, and quite frankly, some of the freight rates we're now seeing are quite scary. And we're slowly getting a grip on this, of course, because you need to see the ships actually go to see the freight rates materialize. And jet fuel may even be an issue if it lasts long enough. And the scenario I painted for you is probably still where that's still manageable, but we'll have to be a bit crafty, right? But it is pretty scary, and particularly because in that scenario I sketched, you probably get an escalation before it de-escalates. But the road to escalation, as I always say, is also escalation, of course. So it's hard to see exactly what happens. Energy is the big focus, but of course very important also for this room, fertilizer, particularly urea. Probably there's room there for more crafty ways. We found out during COVID that we can be creative, right? We have to see though what other governments are doing. We know that India, for example, is aggressively buying at the moment. And we have to realize that for some of these economies, this is a life or death matter, right? If they have starvation in the poorer countries, it's a revolution against the government. So they're not producing for export, they're producing for stability of the regime. So they may panic buy much more aggressively from that perspective, or put restrictions in place where they're not necessarily needed yet, but just because politically they can't export diesel or fertilizer at this moment. Two more observations. To the extent you're in the mildest scenarios, you're typically in market-driven talk, right? It's a matter of the price is higher, and you have to deal with it. That's something I think you're all very familiar with. It means someone's margins get hit. It's not a pleasant story, but but again, something you're familiar with. We have to figure out who bears the losses where, et cetera, et cetera. If you get to the more extreme scenarios, it also becomes more about, is it actually available? The market doesn't clear. It's simply not there. And you have to then start thinking about scenarios like rationing, because it's simply not there and you have to deal with that scarcity. So that's something to bear in mind, if you will. I have one more issue, but it escapes me at the moment, so we'll see if it comes back. But there you go. It's quite challenging there from that perspective. I remember it already. The last bit I wanted to share is how many people are capable of overseeing the entire global system from a physical perspective, right? I lead a team of financial markets analysts. I can tell you, when it comes to the physical economy, it's challenging for people to understand it. So I'm also wondering, if it lasts long enough, what unexpected issues are going to pop up? I was educated the past couple of weeks that helium is apparently an issue. But I was already thinking, for example, about packaging. If we can't get packaging produced in the same way, does that lead to problems with conservation? Now, I suspect we're going to have a few more of these pop up in the upcoming weeks, where suddenly we're like, okay, what does this mean, right? So we have to bear that in mind. It's not unmanageable in these depicted, but we have to keep a good look on it. Europe is also in quite a tough position here. And like I said, it wants to be strategic autonomous, but there's a stack of fast-moving issues here that are pushing it off course. Europe, though, is solidly in the US camp, simply a little bit like it is here, right, in Australia. Maybe a bit grumpily, but definitely in the US camp from that perspective. What does Putin want for a strategy? Well, the Russians are mainly after a Russian sphere of influence. And Putin, a number of years ago, wrote an essay in which he said he wanted to reconstitute the empire of Tsar Peter. Now, we all laughed a little bit when he said that, but he was serious. And he's been waging a war in Ukraine for the past 4 years to make that point, which has gone terribly wrong, but he's bet everything on it. Russian influence across the globe has waned, right? He really has paid the price for this. And recently, of course, in Venezuela and Iran, he's not exactly gaining victories, although he might still benefit from the situation in Iran. But he's definitely been losing influence there. And he's very much beholden to China. But like we said already, he has that spoiler hand. Trump's trying to make a deal with Putin. But Putin's been playing coy because he thinks by holding out, Trump will get more desperate and offer him more. And of course, Putin is dangling the billions of trade that Russia is willing to do there. So we'll see. We know that the US has already lowered sanctions on Russia in the aftermath of the war, and they're allowing the Indians to buy Russian oil again. And of course, the Chinese have always been buying Russian oil and gas. And let me wrap it up there with that view on China, because I said it was essentially a conflict between the US and China, right? That is at the heart of this, or at least the anticipation thereof. What does China want? What is its strategy? Well, definitely hegemony of Asia. And while this may make sense for such a strong and ascendant country, its Asian neighbors typically get uncomfortable with that, and I would say its Asia-Pacific neighbors get uncomfortable with that. But they are definitely working on that. They've built influence everywhere across the globe. But it's also fair to say that if you look at the list of priorities, Xi Jinping at any speech would say, my number one priority is reunification of the motherland with Taiwan. And that's, of course, the big one to watch. He's told his military to prepare for this by 2027. He says preferably peaceful, but if needed by force. So he keeps that option open. And it's important to emphasize that the rest of the world is interested in Taiwan primarily because of semiconductors. But for Xi Jinping, it's not about economic rationale or semiconductors. Right? They're important to him, but he realizes that if there is ever a conflict over Taiwan, that probably is lost. No, for him, this is to find the final resolution there when it comes to the civil war that was waged in China a long time ago. This is where Chiang Kai-shek took the Kuomintang, the losing party in the civil war. The Communist Party won, the Kuomintang lost. Chiang Kai-shek took the Kuomintang to Taiwan, and that's where they hold out now, all those years later. Of course, Taiwan has changed, but in Xi Jinping's eyes, this is an unresolved threat. And he must find it quite galling that the rest of the world is actually interfering with this. So that makes it emotional, it makes it personal for the Chinese, and therefore dangerous, if you will. Xi has two aces. He has weaponized supply chains, pharmaceuticals, iron lithium batteries, a couple of other technologies, and importantly, rare earths. And he holds significant heft over the world and also the US as a result. But his other ace is that he could threaten to do something with Taiwan. And because people sometimes ask, how does this look? Would this be a war? I think the most logical expectation would be that he would blockade Taiwan and see what happens. Now, of course, with the US stuck into the Middle East at the moment, and so many resources being drawn there, that creates a dangerous nexus, if you will, right? And raises the risk that, of course, China rolls the dice on this earlier. So it's very sobering to think of, because we have enough disruption as it is, if you will. Balancing that is that Xi, too, has to keep economic stability in place in China, and China is very heavily hurt by the situation in the Middle East. Right? It depends heavily still on that energy there. So it may not be the right time for him from that perspective. I'll wrap it up there. Against the backdrop of all of this, and hopefully some helpful insights, I'll ask you the simple question: do you have the right cards? I'll be here the rest of the day, so if you want to ask me some questions one-on-one, please hit me up. Thank you very much.